My hotel key card stopped working at 11 at night, in a guest house 2 hours past the last town with a working ATM, and the woman at the desk kept swiping it like the fourth try would be different from the first three. I already knew why. Griffin had frozen my expense account. I could feel it the way you feel a storm before the sky changes, that specific static that comes from someone deciding, from 6,000 miles away, that you're a problem they can simply switch off. My name is Renata Solis. I audit tea shipments for a living, which sounds unglamorous until you understand that a single contaminated lot can poison a company's reputation for a decade. I'd spent 9 years learning to read moisture percentages and batch codes the way other people read faces, and for the last 3 of those years I'd been doing it for Thistlewood Tea Company under a vice president of sourcing named Griffin Marsh, a man who wore his confidence like cologne and had never once, in 3 years, learned to spell my last name correctly on an internal memo. He took my findings to the board dressed up as his own instincts, presenting my moisture curves and rejection rates in meetings I wasn't invited to, then summarizing them back to me afterward as though I hadn't written the report myself. I let him, mostly because I was raising my son Theo alone, since his father decided fatherhood was a phase rather than a job, and steady work matters more than credit when there's a 9-year-old at home who needs new sneakers every 4 months and a mother who shows up to parent-teacher conferences without apologizing for being tired. Griffin had a talent for making generosity look like a favor. He'd approve my time off for Theo's appointments with a sigh audible enough to make sure I felt indebted for the rest of the month. 2 weeks earlier, Griffin had told me, almost cheerfully, that I needed to fly to Sri Lanka to finalize sign-off on a large lot of high-grade black tea from Amara Hill Estate before the quarterly earnings call. I didn't love the timing. Theo had a science fair that Friday, a volcano he'd been building for a month out of chicken wire and papier-mâché, and I'd promised him I'd be in the front row. I went anyway, because Griffin had a way of making anyway feel like the only acceptable answer, and because I told myself I'd be home in 4 days. The estate manager, a soft-spoken third-generation planter named Rohan Pereira, walked me through the drying sheds himself, proud in the way people are when they've spent their whole lives perfecting one thing. But something in the paperwork didn't sit right with me almost immediately. The batch numbers on the shipping manifest didn't match the numbers stamped on the actual tea chests. The lab certificate attached to the file was dated 4 days after the samples had supposedly been tested. I've spent too many years staring at these documents to call that a clerical error. So instead of signing anything, I asked Rohan for the original paper logs, the ones that never make it into the company's digital system, and I stayed up 2 nights cross-referencing them by lamplight in the estate's back office, because the electricity there cuts out after 10, and the generator only ran for emergencies. The office smelled of cured leaf and diesel, and moths kept finding the one working bulb while I laid ledgers across a desk built for a smaller century. What I found was worse than I expected. An entire lot had failed a mold screening back in Colombo, flagged in red ink by a lab technician who had clearly assumed someone senior would act on it, and someone at Thistlewood had swapped in a clean certificate from a different, smaller batch to make the numbers work for the earnings call. Rohan hadn't done it. His signature had been lifted from an old form and pasted onto a new one, badly enough that the letterhead didn't even match the date, and he was furious in the quiet, controlled way of a man protecting 3 generations of his family's name from a decision made in an office he'd never set foot in. That was when my card stopped working. Griffin, it turned out, had a way of knowing when someone was digging where he didn't want them to dig, and rather than call me and ask what I'd found, he tried to strand me, betting I'd panic, sign whatever needed signing, and fly home before I could think too hard about any of it. He miscalculated badly. I wasn't stranded with nothing. I was stranded with proof. Rohan and I spent that night building a case instead of an apology. We photographed every mismatched batch number, scanned the original lab reports, time-stamped everything against the shipping logs, and had his cousin, who worked in Colombo, courier the physical documents to a lawyer Rohan trusted, just in case anything digital went missing. He also put me on the estate's own account for a red-eye flight home, waving off my thanks with the kind of dry humor that told me he'd been waiting 3 years for someone at Thistlewood to actually look closely at anything. The board's quarterly call was scheduled for 9 the next morning. I landed at 6, drove straight from the airport still wearing yesterday's clothes, and walked into the boardroom 11 minutes before Griffin was set to present record output numbers built on a lot of tea that should never have left the warehouse. Nobody was expecting me. Griffin's face did something complicated when I sat down and opened my laptop without asking permission. I didn't yell. I didn't need to. I put the mismatched batch numbers on the screen next to the falsified certificate next to the original, dated 4 days later lab report, and let the documents make the argument I'd spent 2 sleepless nights assembling. I explained calmly that the numbers Griffin was about to present were built on a shipment that had failed contamination screening, and that the paperwork proving otherwise had been altered after an estate manager's signature was lifted and reused without his knowledge. The room went very still in that particular way. Rooms go still when everyone realizes at once who's about to lose their job. The board didn't need convincing twice. Griffin was walked out that afternoon, and by the following week, 2 other falsified reports from his tenure had surfaced once people started actually checking his work, instead of trusting his confidence. He hasn't worked in sourcing since. Word travels fast in an industry this small, and nobody wants to be the next company whose name ends up next to his in a supply chain scandal. What surprised me wasn't the fallout. It was what came after. The board didn't just remove Griffin. They asked me to build the auditing protocol that should have existed all along, with real authority to sign off or reject any shipment without anyone's approval standing between my findings and the truth. I missed Theo's science fair, but I got home in time to watch him rebuild his volcano's eruption mechanism at the kitchen table. Baking soda and vinegar fizzing over a hand-painted mountain that had lost half its papier-mâché in transit, and I told him the truth about where I'd been and why, leaving out the parts that weren't his to carry yet. He asked if I'd been scared. I told him yes, mostly of being believed, and then discovering I'd been wrong. I wasn't wrong. He seemed satisfied with that, in the specific way 9-year-olds are satisfied by a clean, factual answer, and went back to arguing with his volcano about proportions. I think about that dead key card sometimes, the way it felt like an ending, when it was actually the first honest thing that had happened to me in 3 years of working for someone who mistook my thoroughness for loyalty he hadn't earned. Being cut off from Griffin's version of my safety net didn't strand me. It just finally showed me I'd built my own.